After the funeral, my wife's mother took my hand and said, "Not tonight." Before we begin the story, don't forget to follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. The ground was frozen all the way through January, and they had to wait 4 days to put Miller in it. Silas stood at the graveside in boots that had belonged to Miller, brown Carolinas with the left heel worn down to the nail. And he thought about that the whole time, the nail, the cold traveling up through Miller's boots into his feet, and not about the box going into the clay-colored ground, not about Joni's shoulder shaking against his arm, not about the diesel smell coming off the backhoe parked 40 yards away behind a stand of pin oaks that had not dropped all their leaves and rattled their dead brown clusters in the wind like something that didn't know enough to let go. The toolbox was in his truck. He'd taken it from Miller's garage the morning after he died, before anyone else was up, loading it into the cab in the dark with the temperature at 8 above and his breath making shapes in the cold air. He hadn't decided to take it. His hands had simply done it, opened the tailgate, lifted the box, slid it behind the seat, and by the time he was back inside with the coffee Joni had made on autopilot, it was done. The red Craftsman, one of the big ones, dented along the right side from when Miller had knocked it off the tailgate of his F-150 in 2003. There was a Daytona sticker on the front panel, half peeled, from a race neither of them had attended. The top latch was broken, had been broken since Silas had known him, and Miller bungee corded it shut with a yellow cord that had been there so long it had faded to the color of old teeth. Silas had put the toolbox behind the passenger seat because he didn't want to explain it to Joni or to Deb, and he didn't want to see it in his rear view on the drive to the cemetery. He should have left it in the garage. He knew that. He also knew he was not going to. After the burial, they went back to the house, Miller and Joni's house, which was now just Joni's house, a thing no one said aloud, and Deb had laid out food on the dining room table, cold cuts and a green bean casserole and 2 kinds of bread, and people stood in clusters holding plates and not finishing their sentences. Deb was Joni's mother. She was 63 and she had driven down from Sandusky in a Buick she'd bought used, and she had put her hair up and worn her good coat, and her hands moved constantly, refilling glasses, straightening napkins, adjusting a dish towel on the oven handle 3 times in the same hour. Silas watched her do it and understood something about her without having a word for it. He had met Miller Trace in 1994 at a Sunoco station on Route 30 outside of Worcester. Miller was fixing a flat on a Chevy Blazer that wasn't his. It belonged to a woman named Paulette who was standing back watching him work, and he'd asked Silas if he had a 4-way lug wrench, and Silas had one, and that was that. They had driven back to Worcester afterward, and Miller had bought Silas a beer at a bar on Liberty Street, and they had talked for 3 hours, which was unusual for Silas, who was not generally a man who talked for 3 hours. Miller was. Miller could talk to anyone about anything and make them feel they had been specifically chosen for the conversation. He had a way of paying attention that was its own form of generosity, looking at you while you spoke as if you were telling him something he had been waiting his whole life to hear. Silas had spent most of his adult life being the kind of man who made other people feel slightly examined. Miller made him feel seen, which was different and took some getting used to. 26 years. Miller had introduced him to Joni at a cookout in 1999, then married her himself in 2001 in a civil ceremony at the county courthouse, because Joni said she didn't want a fuss, and Miller had given Silas the ring to hold during the ceremony because he said his hands shook when he was nervous, and he didn't want to drop it. Silas had held it in his fist the whole time, that small gold ring feeling its weight, and afterward Miller had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you, see," which was the kind of thing Miller said easily and meant every time. Silas had not told anyone about the ring, not after Miller got sick, not after. Outside, the temperature had come up 2 degrees since morning, still below freezing but the kind of cold that felt like it was considering a change of plans. Silas stood on the back porch of the house with a paper plate he wasn't going to eat from and looked at the yard. Miller had poured a concrete pad out back years ago for a basketball hoop that Silas had helped him put up, and they had used exactly once before the rim cracked. The pad was still there, a gray square dusted with snow, and there was a crack running through it now where the frost had gotten in and done what frost does. Joni came out and stood next to him. She had taken off her good shoes and was wearing the wool socks with the snowflakes on them that she wore every winter. "People keep touching my arm," Joni said. Like I might fly off." "You're not going to fly off." "No," she looked at the concrete pad. "He never fixed that crack." "I know. He said he was going to every spring." They stood there a while. The cold was the kind that didn't announce itself until you'd been in it long enough to realize your face had stopped feeling like yours. Silas had a scar on his left hand from a table saw, a thin white line, and in cold weather it ached. It was aching now. "You can stay," Joni said. "If you want, Deb's staying." "I'll take the couch," he said. She went back inside without saying anything, which he understood to mean yes. That night after everyone was gone and Joni had gone upstairs and Deb was in the guest room, Silas lay on the couch under an Afghan that smelled like the house, like Murphy oil soap, and something floral, and underneath all that the smell of a house that had been lived in by the same people for years. And he stared at the ceiling. There was a water stain shaped roughly like the state of West Virginia. Miller had pointed it out once, claimed he'd been meaning to patch it, and Silas had said he was going to drive himself crazy looking at it, and Miller had said he'd had 4 years and it hadn't happened yet. That was 2014. The stain was still there. Silas looked at it for a long time and then he stopped looking at it and just lay in the dark of the house and listened to it settle. In the morning Deb was up before anyone, making coffee in the kitchen in her robe, her gray hair loose and uncombed. He came in and she was standing at the counter and she turned and looked at him and poured him a mug without asking how he took it. She'd seen him take it black 100 times. She handed it over and said nothing, and he said nothing, and he took the coffee and stood at the window, and outside the concrete pad was just beginning to show itself through the snow in the early light. He drove home that afternoon. The toolbox stayed in the truck. What happened next happened slowly, the way Ohio winters end. Not all at once, but in these grudging, incremental retreats where you wake up one morning and realize you haven't thought about the cold in 3 days. Joni called him in February about a leak under the kitchen sink. He drove out and fixed it. He came back in March when the gutters pulled loose on the east side of the house from ice damming. In April, he helped Joni file the estate paperwork because she said the forms made her eyes slide off the page, and he sat at Miller's kitchen table and read the forms aloud and pointed to the lines, and she signed where she needed to sign. By May, he was coming out on weekends. He told himself it was because Joni needed help, which was true. He told himself it was because Miller would have done the same, which was also true, and also not the whole truth in a way he was not yet able to examine. Deb was there sometimes, not every weekend but often. She had cut back her hours at the dental office in Sandusky, and she drove down to Crestline on Friday afternoons, and she made food. Not the kind people made for grieving families, but the food you make because you're hungry and you know what you like. A pork roast. Pasta with vegetables from the garden she'd started in Joni's backyard, tomatoes and zucchini, and one stubborn row of beans. In June, Silas replaced the cabinet hinge in the upstairs bathroom, a self-closing hinge from the hardware store, $2.40, 10 minutes with a screwdriver. The old one had squeaked. He was nearly back down the stairs when Deb appeared at the top. "What did you do to the hinge?" she said, not a question. "Replaced it, that squeak was." "I like that squeak." Her voice was level, not unkind, but it had a quality in it like a door held open just enough to let the cold in. It let me know when he was coming to bed. He stood on the stair and did not say anything. She looked at him for a moment and then she went back into the bathroom and closed the door, the new hinge drawing it quietly, silently shut. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes before he started it. He did not go back in to explain himself. There was nothing to explain. She was right that the squeak was gone. She was right about what it had meant. He had not thought about what it meant, which was not the same as not knowing. He came back the following weekend. Deb did not mention the hinge. Neither did he. But he found himself, after that, asking before he fixed things, not formally, not making a production of it, but pausing at the edge of a repair in a way he hadn't before. "You want me to look at that gutter?" Waiting for someone to say yes. By August she was handing him coffee without being asked. By September they talked on the porch in the evenings after Joni went to bed, in the way people talk when they have stopped being strangers but have not yet decided what they are instead. She had a small scar below her left eye, faint, that he'd noticed in the summer and never asked about. She wore a blue cardigan in the evenings when the air came off the fields with some authority. She had opinions about things, about the new manager at the grocery store who kept moving the aisles, about the county's plan to repave Route 30, about a novel she was reading that she said had no business being as long as it was. He listened. Miller had taught him how. In October, she brought the Buick to his shop on a Friday evening at 5:30 when he was about to lock up. He was under the rear rotors until 7. When he came out, she had bought coffee from the gas station next door and was sitting on an overturned bucket reading her paperback, and she handed him the coffee without looking up from the book. He stood there drinking it in his work clothes with the grease on his hands and the cold coming in under the shop door, and she turned a page. He thought about Miller constantly. He thought about him while fixing the things Miller hadn't fixed, the crack in the pad, the stain on the ceiling, the gutters, and he thought about him at other times too, driving back to Canton on Sunday evenings with the highway empty and the fields black on either side. Before Miller died, before the sickness even, Silas had lived alone in his Canton apartment and he had told himself, content. He had work. He had Miller and Joni for holidays. He had constructed a life that required very little of him, and he had called this independence. He did not examine this thought directly. He wasn't built for it, but he felt its edges in the way you feel the edges of a room in the dark. November came and the weather turned again, that first cold that smells like iron and sits on top of the ground for a day before it gets serious. Silas was at the house on a Saturday when the furnace started making a sound it wasn't supposed to make, a metallic clicking on the ignition cycle. He went to the basement and looked at it and found the problem and drove to the supply house in Mansfield and came back with the part and fixed it. And when he came up, Joni had made soup and Deb had set the table and there were 3 places set, which was not discussed, just done, and they sat down and ate. It was the kind of meal where the talking was not really about anything. The soup was good, a bean and ham soup, Deb's recipe that was really her mother's recipe. And outside the window the dark came down early the way it does in Ohio in November, and the porch light came on automatically, and the light fell on the dead garden and the frozen pad and the crack that still ran through it. He had been going to leave after dinner, but the furnace had taken longer than expected, and by 8 o'clock Joni had fallen asleep in the armchair with the television on low, and it seemed wrong to leave Deb to wake her and get her upstairs alone. Joni woke at 9 and went up herself, and he and Deb sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee. "She's better," Deb said. "Yeah. Not all the way, but better is enough," he said. She looked at him in the way she'd looked at him that first morning, the unguarded quality, the quality of a person who had stopped performing. She was wearing the blue cardigan. Outside, the porch light held a small yellow circle against the dark. "You could sleep on the couch again," she said. "It's late." "All right," he said. She rinsed her mug. He rinsed his. She said good night and went to the guest room, and he lay on the couch under the same Afghan and looked at the West Virginia stain and thought about what he was doing, not in the sense of a man analyzing his choices, but in the simpler sense of a man lying still enough in the dark to notice what is already true. The pipe burst the third week of January. It was the year's coldest night, the temperature dropping to 4 above, and the pipe was the cold water supply to the kitchen, a section of copper that ran along the exterior wall where the insulation had never been good enough. It went at 11:15, not a pop but a sudden rushing sound, water going where it is not supposed to go. Silas was on the couch and he was on the floor before he was fully awake, finding the wet, following it to the cabinet under the sink. He knew where the shutoff was. He got the water off and then he was on his hands and knees on the wet linoleum with his phone for a light, and he could see the split pipe and he knew what he needed. He went to his truck to get it. He came back with the toolbox. He had not planned this. The box was simply in the truck, had been in the truck since January a year ago, and he needed a repair coupler, and he didn't have one loose. And he opened the tailgate in the 4 above air, and there was the red Craftsman with its broken latch and its faded bungee cord and its Daytona sticker catching the truck's dome light. He took off the cord and opened it and found the coupler in the second tray. He smelled the interior for just a moment, metal and oil and something he was not going to name, and then he closed it and lifted it out of the truck and carried it inside. He was back on the floor when Cass appeared in the doorway. Cass was Joni's daughter from before Miller, 17, and she had been away at her father's through Christmas, and she had come back 3 days ago, and she was not doing well with any of it. She was standing in the doorway in a sweatshirt and she was crying, had been crying before she came downstairs, and she said something about a text from a boy and a thing at school, her voice rising with the specific injustice of 17, and Silas was on the floor with his phone in his teeth. "I need the flashlight," he said, "the big one in the utility drawer." "I'm trying to tell you." "I know, flashlight first." She got it. He held it in his teeth. The split was 4 inches and he had the coupler and he needed 30 minutes. He worked and she stood in the doorway in the way that people stand when they do not know if they are needed. "Are you staying?" she said. "Like staying." He was on his back under the cabinet. "Get your mom," he said. "Tell her the cold water's off and not to use it." "That's not what I asked." He stopped working. He was on the floor in the dark with the flashlight and the water and the cold from 4 above seeping in through the wall, and Cass was in the doorway waiting, and the question was exactly what it was. "Go get your mom," he said. "I'll be here when you get back." She went. He worked. Joni came down and Deb came down and the kitchen light was on and Deb made tea and Joni said something quiet to Cass and Cass said something quiet back, and he could hear all of it and could not hear any of it because the blood was in his ears from bending over. When he came out from under the cabinet his knees were wet and his back was stiff. He turned the shutoff on. He watched the connection. It held. "Done," he said. Deb handed him a dish towel for his hands. He dried them, the grease from earlier, the copper smell, the scar on his left hand catching the kitchen light, that thin white line. His hands. He looked at them for a moment the way you look at something you've carried so long you stop seeing it. Joni said she was going back to bed. Cass said she was too. Then they were gone and he was alone in the kitchen with Deb and the toolbox on the floor where he'd left it, the broken latch up, the bungee cord on the counter beside it. He bent to pick up the box. "Leave it," Deb said. He straightened. She was looking at the box, not at him, and her face had the particular quality it got when she was deciding whether to say a thing. "It belongs under the stairs," she said. "I'll show you where." She opened the door to the basement stair and reached in and turned on the light, and there was a shelf just inside, built by someone before Miller, deep and solid. She didn't take the box. She just held the door. He carried it over and set it on the shelf. It fit exactly. She let the door close. "I owe you a new hinge," he said. She looked at him then. Something moved through her face, not forgiveness exactly, because she had not been holding a grievance, but something more like acknowledgement, the same small gold weight that changes hands between people who have decided to trust each other with it. No, you don't, she said. They were quiet then. The kitchen was settling back toward ordinary. Outside the window, the concrete pad was dark and clear of snow, the crack running through it the same as always, and the cold was the kind that would be worse before it was better. He looked at the window, at the pad. He'd been meaning to break it up and relevel it since September. I can get a jackhammer in here before the next freeze, he said. Get that crack sorted, maybe pour in March when the ground. She took his hand. Just that, her hand, finding his in the kitchen light, closing over the scar and the grease and the cold from the floor. Her skin was papery and warm, and she held on for a moment that was not long and was not short. Not tonight, Silas, she said. The house can stay broken for one more night. She looked at him with the directness that had taken him all year to stop being startled by. Just sit down. He sat down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. She poured the last of the tea. The porch light was on. Outside, Ohio in January was doing what it always does, taking the temperature down another degree, and then another, the way it does when it means business. And in the kitchen there was the ordinary sound of two people sitting across from each other at 11:30 at night with no particular reason to be anywhere else. The January thaw came the last week of the month, the way it always does, brief, grudging, not quite trustworthy. The temperature climbed to 45 and the snow turned to gray mush, and in the morning the crack in the concrete pad was dark with melt water, the frost retreating to wherever frost retreats. On the thaw's second day, Silas drove to Crestline in the early afternoon with the windows down. He took Route 30, the long way, past the Sunoco where he had first met Miller, which was a BP now and had been for years, and he didn't slow down when he passed it, but he noticed it the way he always noticed it, the way you notice the place where something started even after the place has changed completely. Deb's Buick was in the drive. He could see light in the kitchen window and the shape of someone moving behind it. He went up the porch steps and opened the door without knocking. She was at the stove. She turned when she heard the door. "Joni's at the grocery store," she said. "The new manager moved the beans again." "I'll be outside," he said. He went around to the back of the house. He stood on the concrete pad in the thaw warmth and looked at the crack. He had a cold chisel in the truck and he didn't get it. He just stood on the pad in Miller's worn-down Carolinas and looked at the crack and thought about the freeze that would come back tonight or tomorrow and fill it again and work it a little wider, the same as every year. The crack was going to outlast the pad. Eventually the whole thing would have to come up. He knew that. He'd known it since September. He went back inside. She called him to lunch and they ate at the kitchen table, the two of them, and the afternoon light came in through the window at the low angle it has in late January and caught the steam from the bowls and held it for a moment, visible, then let it go. She passed him the bread. He took it. They talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, which is the same conversation in a house like this, in a January like this. Later, after Joni came home, after dinner, after the dishes, after Joni went to bed, Deb put on her coat and said she was driving back to Sandusky. He walked her out. They stood on the porch in the cold coming back after the thaw, and the porch light was on above them and their breath showed in it. She pulled her keys out. She looked at him. "Next weekend," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She went down the steps. He stayed on the porch until the Buick's taillights were gone past the elm at the end of the block. He stood a moment after. The cold was returning in earnest now, the thaw giving up its pretense the way it always does, and the concrete pad was already going gray as the melt water refroze in the crack. He went inside. He turned off the porch light, then stood still in the front room for a moment in the dark. Then he went to the couch and lay down and pulled the Afghan over him and looked up at the ceiling. The West Virginia stain was there in the gray light from the window, the same as always, and he looked at it for a little while and then he stopped looking at it. Down the hall under the basement stair on the shelf someone before Miller had built, the red toolbox sat in the dark. Both latches were closed. The bungee cord was gone. He had left it on the counter the night of the pipe, and at some point it had been thrown away, by Joni or by Deb, without comment, without ceremony. The Daytona sticker was still there. The dent on the right side was still there. The latch was still broken. It would keep. Most things did if you let them. Outside, the temperature dropped through the night. By morning, the crack in the pad would be a little wider. By March, he would know whether to break the whole thing up or just let it go another year. There was time. There was, he understood now, more time than he had known what to do with, and people at last to spend it on. He closed his eyes. The house settled around him in the cold, its pipes and joists and plaster doing what old houses do, talking to themselves in the dark, working out where they stand.